Welcome back to Bookkeeper Launch, bookkeepers.com, everybody. I'm Sam Robinson here, joined by Mike Coffey of Imperative. Mike is the founder and president of Imperative, and he specializes in doing background checks for businesses. And it's kind of a funny story how he came about getting into background checks and starting Imperative, but I'll let him introduce himself. Mike, go ahead and take it away.
I'm Mike Coffey, and I'm a licensed private investigator, but I'm also a career HR professional. I just have to have the PI license first to sound cool, but also because it's required to do that to do background checks here in Texas and in other states. I was an HR pro who worked in healthcare and aerospace, and then in order to manage in the 90s before the internet, in order to manage our relationship with our background screening vendor in the healthcare system I was in, I had to become an expert in background checks to manage that relationship. And then when left that and went into consulting and still have an HR consulting practice, but had one client early on in about 99 who needed better background checks, and they'd had a big internal theft. It was a financial services firm, and the FBI was involved. And the FBI is like, why did you hire this person? And because their rap sheet was, significant, and their background check had come back clear. And so they needed better background checks, and one thing led to the other. And I ended up, for that one client, getting into background checks. I really didn't want to because I'd have to hire employees and get a PI license and all that. And I just mentioned it to my wife that night, and she was pregnant with our first kid. And she said, well, buddy, you better figure something out because I'm not going back to work. And that's the only time we ever discussed whether she was going to be a stay-at-home mom. And it's how I got into the background screening business because it was revenue. So, and I've been doing it now for 27 years. And we deal with clients who are risk averse. So you can buy a $50 background check on the internet, but you're getting what you pay for. And we deal with clients who've either been burned doing that or who are just naturally, because of their business or their personality, very risk averse and really want to know more about the people that they're involving in their business. So that's kind of we're at the deep end of the swimming pool for the background investigations and business due diligence projects.
Well, awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that. That's so funny. As someone who just had their first child, I can't imagine. I can imagine my wife definitely saying, "You got to figure it out, buddy." And
Yeah.
it's funny that you didn't even necessarily want to do that or become a PI, yet here you are doing background checks 27 years later. That's great.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a real need for that. It's almost in the same vein as having insurance or needing an attorney. You don't want to think about it, you don't want to have it, but when you've been burnt before, or something like you need insurance, life dictates that it's nice to have it. And that's the same principle with doing background checks. You don't want to get burnt by who you're doing work with. And there's a
Yeah,
real
nobody understands policy limits on insurance until after you've had something happen and suddenly you realize, oh, I've got this giant deductible or my policy's only going to cover this much.
Absolutely. Well, and that kind of leads into the first segment here, with our audience being people that have either started or currently underway with running their own bookkeeping business. There is an absolutely paramount need for trust, whether it's between them and their clients and other professionals like accountants and tax pros. Trust is absolutely the currency of this business. I mean, people are requiring you to look into their financial records and set everything correctly with 100% accuracy. So it's not even a nice to have, it's a requirement. But I think that a lot of times bookkeepers can neglect to cover themselves when it comes to this, especially with doing background checks, whether it's on people that they work with or their clients. So I'll have one question to start off with you. Why do you think it is that bookkeeping firm owners often underestimate the amount of risk they take on every day?
Well, we all have this idea that we have this unique insight into the human soul and we really trust our own instincts, and, that works 85, 90% of the time, right? And, if you feel that liver quiver, it probably is telling you something, if it's caused, but when you feel warm towards somebody, you always have to question that. And that's the one and so sometimes they often people get taken advantage of by people who have a lot of commonalities with them. So, we instinctively trust people who go to our same kind of church we go to or have the same, general background or grew up in our community, those kinds of things. And so we trust our instincts. And then there are just people who aren't bad people, but they are people who make critical errors in judgment given a certain opportunity. And most of your fraud is a matter of opportunity. It's, we see we do hundreds of thousands of background checks, and I see a lot of the records. And, some people have rap sheets where they're doing all kinds of offenses just because they have poor self-management or they're just very dishonest people. But then a lot of people just have one or two offenses, and you look at it and the rest of their history, and it looks like it's an aberration. But what it really is they just made a bad decision at the wrong, at a certain time. I think the other thing that happens in like bookkeeping and a lot of the clients that we work with that aren't heavily regulated, like our CPA firms, we work with some of the, largest CPA firms in the southern United States, and they have a lot of regulation on them, especially on the audit side and all of that. So we do a lot of due diligence on their audit clients before they onboard them and that kind of things. But bookkeepers, there's a certain level with, I think if you're a tax preparer, but other than that, at least here in Texas, there's not really a lot of, licensing or things like that to get into the bookkeeping business. And so entrepreneurs are always looking to cut cost or avoid cost. And so you come in and you say, okay, well, I'm going to, if the state doesn't think isn't mandating that I do this, then why would I go spend this money doing it? And I have that conversation sometimes, and I'll never convince somebody to do more than they want it, than they're going to do until something goes wrong. But sometimes just because the state's not regulating at that level doesn't mean there's not risk from civil litigation or just your reputation. And once you've burned your reputation, something goes wrong and you're in the local newspaper or on the internet, people are talking about this thing that happened and this bookkeeper is named, there goes your company. And sometimes we also we feel the pressure to make a decision. Like we need to hire somebody right now. I don't have time to wait, for a background check. Or this client is really putting a lot of pressure on us to get rolling. And so I don't have time to do my know your customer information or my other due diligence. And so we feel pressure and we do. And so there's a variety of reasons, but the risk is there. And that's the other thing. A lot of companies don't have a structure for evaluating the risk, especially on the client side. And so they kind of do a one size fits all. But in the bookkeeping world, and financial services, the more complex the client, the more ambiguous maybe some of the revenue streams are, things like that, the higher level of due diligence you probably need to do just to, if only to stay out of, criminal litigation or civil litigation of some sort because your client's doing something hinky and, somebody is going to say at some point you knew or should have known what was going on.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that too. And yeah, it just goes back to what you said earlier, the trust being the currency, and just mentioned it doesn't even need to be, anything criminal. If there's something that breaches that trust and your reputation goes down, no one's going to trust you to record their transactions or do any sort of financial reporting for them ever again, and no one will want to work with you. So it's absolutely important that people don't cut corners when it comes to doing their due diligence on the people that they're working with, especially as bookkeepers. Now that makes me want to transition into one of the first phases that a bookkeeper can be more diligent with who they work with, and that is hiring within their firm. Hiring remote bookkeepers or anyone that comes to the office, any sort of virtual assistants, contractors, anybody that's going to be granted partial or full access to client financial information. So I would ask, what should bookkeeping firm owners verify first before hiring with these people?
Yeah, it's funny because people have these business owners often had this idea that if it's a W-2 employee, I'm going to do, I really need to do a lot of due diligence. But then they're perfectly comfortable. Oh, they're 1099, or, and like that makes any different. The level of access, the level of control, or, oh, they're virtual. They're in another country. There's nothing I can do. Well, that's even more risk that you're taking on, because good luck ever investigating, an identity theft issue in the Philippines or any place else. So you really need to know who you're dealing with in those cases. So the first thing you have to do, and it's the most basic level, is verify they are who they say they are. And now with technology and the way AI is being used, is you can actually use biometrics to verify they are who they say they are. So their state or government issued ID, even in other countries, and they can take a live photo of their ID or their passport, and then they can take a live selfie with that, and AI will match first that document is as it should be, that it's laid out correctly, that if it's got any checksums or things like that to validate it, that those match out. And then the AI takes that photo. It also searches for things. We catch them all the time. People using their ID on like a photo of their ID, and they're trying to use their phone, and let that be it. And it catches that, looks for any tampering. And then it matches the live selfie video that they did to the photo on the ID and gives you a percentage match. And we started doing this a few years ago because we've got several tech clients, and they're getting hit by North Koreans. If you haven't read about the North Koreans, just Google North Korean identities. It's terrifying. They're stealing the identities of real American workers. They're going on LinkedIn, or they're even posting jobs and having people apply for those jobs. And then they ghost them after they get their name, date of birth, social security number, and all of that. And then they go apply for jobs, stealing their identities as, remote tech jobs. And they're doing the work from North Korea, China, and Russia. And then once they're inside the company, they've got access to all the networks and everything, and they can just do whatever they want. And the same thing would be, the situation hiring a remote bookkeeper. Once they've got access to, your accounting software, they've got access to bank accounts, client information, how many social securities numbers do you have on your 1099 clients and all of that, and vendors, all of that stuff. And so at a minimum, and it's not just enough just to collect it anymore. It used to be name, date of birth, social security number. We'll run it through the credit bureau and just get a list of addresses and stuff. But now we can do so much better, and we know we're dealing with that right person, that same person, whether it's in person or remotely. And then at a minimum, searching their criminal history. And we could talk an hour about criminal history, but there's multiple levels. And what you want here in your world is the most thorough criminal history available. It doesn't make sense to say, well, only 2% of the criminal cases out there come out of the federal courts. So I can, that's low risk. Well, those are embezzlement, interstate drug and gun crimes, those serious federal offenses. And you're just going to say, I'm not going to worry about those. And so you've got to really run that really thorough criminal. And then I spend a lot of time talking clients out of running credit, because most clients think credit's not going to tell the story. They think it's going to tell the story it doesn't tell. It's going to tell them how reliable this person is, or do they meet their commitments. Well, there's reasons people have bad credit. And sometimes you pull a credit report and you see a lot of medical history, things like that. And that's one reason. But what credit can say is this person living beyond their means? And, if somebody's employment history suggests they've been making $65,000 a year, and, you see a car loan for $60,000 and a house mortgage payment, and all of those, you can quickly figure out this person's either under a lot of strain, they're going to have a lot of temptation and pressure financially. Maybe we're going to be extra cautious about them. And then verify, and this is the thing that most employers just fail to do completely, verify all their claims about their experience, their credentials, and their training or education. People lie. We catch more people lying about their employment history and their education history than their criminal history. And so people know that most employers don't check it. And so you've got to do that. And that's just the minimum. But then if you get into if you're giving somebody access to especially client accounts, and, they can get into client bank accounts, or they can, hopefully just there's some checks and balances. They can set something up for bill pay, but somebody else has got to approve it, or those kind of things. I think you need to look at their civil litigation history too on an employee. If somebody's going to be making decisions on behalf of your company or your clients, you've got to look who has sued them, who have they sued, what were the circumstances. Maybe it's not relevant. I'm not saying just because somebody has a criminal history or a civil litigation history, that means you're not going to hire them, but you can't evaluate whether that information is relevant or not unless you know what it is. And so all those things should be things that employers are looking at in your world. Then there's dozens of other things that our clients run, but those are the basics that make a big difference.
That's absolutely crazy that people will more likely lie about their job experience or their education, but it makes more sense because, there's probably, even with the dangers, as you said, and people should do background checks, there's probably less criminals applying for bookkeeping jobs than there are people that are willing to stretch the truth about how qualified they are because of education or experience. But that doesn't surprise me that people would, stretch the truth a little bit when it comes to education.
Sometimes it's not a little bit. We talk to the school, and the school's never heard of them. And, we see people claiming MBAs, and there's no undergraduate. They never even finished an undergrad program. And then, we've got a section on our website called Bad Hire Days. It's at badhiredays.com. And it's just stories of employers who got taken advantage of by employees who they didn't, they have a really bad case of, I wish I knew then what I know now, and what they did to them. And it's, either they lied about their history, or they lied about their criminal history, or their background. So it's crazy.
Well, we might have to circle back to those bad hire stories towards the end, but I just want to move on to the next section, and that's going into client due diligence. Now, it may seem on the surface not nearly as imperative, pun intended, as doing background checks on the people that you're going to be working with. But these are people who you're handling their finances. You don't know their story. You don't know everything. What would you say is the biggest red flags or behaviors that tend to predict that this client is going to be a future problem?
Well, the first one is unwillingness to participate in your know your customer, your KYC process. That's always a big red flag because if they've got any level of sophistication at all, they're going to understand why you're doing it. And they're probably going to appreciate it. They ought to appreciate that you're building guardrails around your organization, and that's the kind of care you're going to give to them, either as an individual or as a business. And so, that's the first one, just they don't want to participate in the process. And then after that, if you have an intake questionnaire that is, asks for information and things, they answer ambiguously, or as you start to verify things, they just don't line up, even minor things.
Mhm.
That's a red flag. And if they, if it's just an individual and they, say, I don't want to give you my social. Well, you know what? You're giving me the keys to the kingdom to your enterprise, allegedly, if, as your bookkeeper. I mean, so it makes sense that I would have, that you need to give me that, or at least go through your third party. There's possibly reasons you may not want to keep that social on file. So you can have your background screening company have it and redact it when you get it back. But at least somebody has verified that the social they provided really does match the other information that they've given. And again, there's nothing, I recommend it's simple and easy, just doing biometrics on anybody coming in as a client. Just have that be part of the, so they've given an ID. It makes you look like you know what you're doing and you verified they are who they are. So, those are the red flags when they don't want to participate.
Yeah. And that could be for a number of reasons, but in your experience, in the context of bookkeeping, what are probably the biggest reasons that these red flag clients don't want to participate in any sort of
A lot of
onboarding?
the ones I've seen, they were always in marginal, poorly regulated industries, cannabis, things like that. I've seen, and we have a client that's in that industry, and their stores are like Apple stores. I mean, they really run it well, and it's real, it's extremely legit in enterprise. But where I've seen any kind of in financial services, especially, anything that gives you liver quiver, it's usually those kind of things because it's becoming more and more regulated, and there's a lot of more black market on it. Vaping companies are and resellers are getting that way. Money services lenders, alleged lenders, things like that, or used car dealers. Those are sometimes money laundering programs. And so they get a little sketchy when you start asking for information. And so for me, there are people who are just like me, very libertarian. They don't want their information out in the world, but I got news for you. It's out there already.
Yeah.
And so I can, for $3, I can get anybody in the U.S.'s name, date of birth, and social. I mean, I've got access to the databases because my PI license, and there's a lot of unethical people with that access. So it's out there, and you just have to make them, comfortable that you're going to use it for legitimate purpose. And, here's what our document destruction program is. Here's what we're going to keep on file versus not, and all of that. But if they just don't want to do it, you've got to decide if the client's worth the risk. I mean, and usually, certainly, we do know your client, we're dealing with social security numbers, dates of birth, addresses, and personal information about individuals. And so our KYC, even on a basic small client, is just what we've talked about here. I know who they are when they come in as a client.
Excellent. Yeah, that kind of information is absolutely crucial to have, especially when working with clients. And you never know, some clients, similar to that example you gave earlier with people that have poor credit scores, maybe they're under financial strain and they're willing to do a lot more fraudulent behaviors with their business and wanting you to basically cover for them. And
Right.
they're probably not going to share that information with you
Up front, right?
when they're trying to hire you as a bookkeeper. It just usually trickles in over time. So it's good to look for those things up front and to have them lay their cards on the table at the start of the relationship rather than take them at their word. Like you said, we like to think that we know the soul of a person, but that's usually where people get burnt there.
Right.
So now going into more of the specifics of what we're trying to do a background check into and protect ourselves against. A bookkeeper is going to typically want to avoid the sort of things that are going to be like embezzlement, payroll fraud, vendor fraud. And I'm also wondering too, how does AI play into this? How do, people that are trying to act nefarious use AI? Because you just mentioned some ways that people can protect themselves in their business by using AI with, bioscanning and stuff. But what are some warning signs usually that happen before a major fraud issue is uncovered? Is there a way to do background checks on someone to uncover that kind of information?
Well, verifying the corporate entities really exist and that they're maintaining their status with the Secretaries of State, or if it's a DBA, that the DBA is really filed at the local county or at the Secretary of State, depending on what the jurisdiction is, that those corporate entities really exist. There's nothing wrong with using a PO box, mailing station, mailboxes to go or whatever. But if it's a manufacturing company or it's a retail shop or it's purporting to be a business that should have a brick and mortar existence, then you should be able to verify that entity exists, right? And that the person you're dealing with is really associated with them, verifying the bank accounts. And so when those things can't be verified, even if they've made these attestations about it, there's red flags there. And then again, their own civil litigation. Who's this? Do you really want to get in bed with somebody who's got a lot of litigation? And so you're going to be getting subpoenas duces tecum for copies of their records and things like that. And those are not what you want. The other thing you always have to do is, we all have, there's responsibilities if we're touching anything financial, is the Office of Foreign Asset Control, specially designated entities, because, there are primarily terrorist organizations around the world that the U.S. government has said they cannot, no U.S. entity can do business with, and they're listed right there on the federal government's website, so you can verify it yourself. And it's extremely rare to get a hit, but you ought to have documentation that this is our process and this is how we do it. And then the making sure that somebody's really got a license for whatever they're supposed to be doing, they say they're doing. You see people saying, "Oh, I'm a massage therapist." This is one we've seen, and what they actually were was a worker. And so if they're really running a massage therapy, a real spa, there's going to be a license associated with that. They're going to have licensed employees and all of that. And, it looks legit from the outside, but if you're not verifying, that's a red flag that, they don't have the license they're supposed to have. And that would be for, that's a specific instance from our experience, but it doesn't matter if they're a barber, a plumber, electrician, whatever they're saying they have. If it's a licensed or regulated industry, you ought to be able to verify that entity and that person, if it's an individual license, has that license. And any of those would be red flags. And then into the relationship, it starts out as a small client, small dollars, and dollars just really start to escalate, and they're doing higher level transactions, and that's without any explanation. And maybe they're just an amazing salesperson, or you should maybe double down on some additional due diligence and understand where this money's coming from, those kinds of things, so that if they're in fraud or money laundering or something like that, you've got documentation. Even if it turns out that they were doing that, you've got documentation. We were concerned about this. Here's the steps we took, and we couldn't find anything that suggested that they were, doing something that they ought not. And that'll just help protect you. But I'm all about documentation all the way through this, all your onboarding of your clients, but also as we move on and they make changes to the processes or the services they are asking for, make sure you document and you think through what's the worst case scenario here, what it might mean, and then try to find ways to verify that it's legit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I'll edit this part out. And so my final questions here, if there's a bookkeeper out there, a bookkeeping business owner that is taking all of this to heart, what's the one thing that they should do starting today when it comes to background checks and verifying the people they work with? If you were to give them a step-by-step process to implement immediately.
I would build the entire, especially on the hiring process, but on either side, I would build a process and just write down step by step what our process is. And on the hiring process, the background check, it's just the lie detector test at the end of the process. A really good hiring process starts with the job description, but at least when you first make that contact with your candidate, and I don't care if they're 1099 or they're offshore or they're going to be a W-2 employee, make them fill out an employment application that asks the questions that you want answered. We all get these resumes. That's great. Resumes are polite lies. That's all it is. I mean, we all know that this person, all the adjectives and these bullet points this person just gave me about how amazing they are or how hardworking they are. Yeah, let's take that by about 10% and maybe it's true. And people, they're deciding what they tell you and what they don't tell you. And nobody lists, I got fired on their resume, right? And so you should have a really good employment application and then use it. Read it before you interview the applicant and notice any inconsistencies or the criminal history question. Always, even if you're not going to do the criminal background check, always at least ask about criminal history and civil litigation history. In this industry, I would always ask, list all your criminal history, list your civil litigation. Now, I do want to say on a state basis and even sometimes municipality by municipality, there are regulations about what employers can use and consider and ask and when you can ask. So you need to, understand that. Your background screening company can probably help you figure that out. We do it state by state, city by city, but ask when you can about criminal history. But and then if they write, we'll discuss as that's a big red flag, right? If you ask about criminal history and they write down, we'll discuss, my answer is always, no, we won't, because we're never going to have the conversation because we're stopping right here. If nothing else, this is a person who's showing me they're not compliance minded. They're going to suggest to me, tell me when my policies have to be followed, or when I have if this is a legal question I can legally ask, then they should answer it. And I don't want to hear, any of their smooth talk about what. Just tell me. If it was murder, tell me. If it was whatever it was. And then I will decide before we even have the interview if it's relevant to the job. For a bookkeeper who's working from home, maybe I don't care about a 5-year-old DWI if that's all that's in their history. But if I see a 5-year-old DWI, then a 3-year-old DWI, and, a failure to appear, and, several little minor things too, that's telling me this is somebody who's not taking care of business. So maybe the DWI itself doesn't suggest a risk by itself. But when I see this whole pattern of just being a knucklehead and having low self-control, then this is probably not my best candidate for somebody who's going to have to be real systems oriented and go step by step and be really consistent and conscientious. That's probably not mine. So asking a really good criminal history question, but asking all those, reasons for termination. And we get liver quiver. We don't like to ask those uncomfortable questions about, well, why did you leave this employer? Or, hey, I see you left this blank. No, ask hard questions. And so when you do that and you get all the information, then all the background check is a lie detector.
Yeah.
And, 9 times out of 10, hopefully, you should be able to proceed with the applicant, because the background check is going to come back and say exactly what they told you. But, it's that 1 out of 10 that's going to be a problem for you. And that's why, but you've got to ask those questions, because why spend the money in the background check and waste the time if the applicant's going to be honest with you and they tell you something and you say, I'm sorry, yeah, that's just not a level of risk I can accept in our organization. Then you can move on to the next candidate before they've moved on to their next job. So for me, it's that whole system and following a whole process.
Yeah, almost like the background check is the icing on the cake. It's prevention over the intervention, which is doing the background check. That totally makes sense. I think that's having a full system versus just one sort of silver bullet there.
And there's and the other thing to understand in the U.S. is there's no national background check. Even the FBI's system, the Department of Justice has the National Crime Information Center, and that's what like when you go to buy a firearm from a federally licensed firearms dealer, they run you through that. And we always hear these stories about people who shouldn't have been able to buy a firearm who did because their database, that's the federal government's database, is so incomplete. And so the records are all at the county level. And so make sure your background check is going county by county, wherever that person's lived, worked, attended school. And then there's other things you can run under it, like a statewide database. But we ran everybody on death row through Texas Department of Public Safety's statewide database, and it was missing 1/3 of the people on death row. That's how bad the state of Texas' own database is. And we knew it would already happen that way because we knew that 1/3 of the records we find at the county level around the state don't show up in DPS's data. And so that's just, there's no national wide. So you've got to pull the data from multiple sources and be as thorough as you can. But you never know, if you ask them up front, they may tell you about, I had this thing in Maricopa County, Arizona, or Clark County, Nevada, which is Las Vegas, 5 years ago. And then maybe they never lived in Clark County, so you don't know to go search Clark County. But then if they tell you something, you go verify it and say, oh, yeah, well, yeah, we don't care about that. Or sometimes they tell you something and you say, okay, well, we'll verify it. And then you find 5 other offenses that they didn't tell you about in the same county. So you always want to follow up on those.
Absolutely. Well, we're getting close to our time, but I just wanted to revisit something you said, the bad hire stories. I just want to hear at least one of those for the audience, just to give us a little fun note on an otherwise somewhat disquieting episode.
Yeah. Well, this will scare you. Okay. So there's on our site, there's a guy named Stephen Robertson, badhiredays.com. He worked for a company. And while he was at that company, he was a network administrator, and he hacked into the network of his previous employer. and taunted, stopped some services and just kind of messed up their system and left taunting notes to the guy who took his job. And so he got arrested in Dallas County and prosecuted, pled guilty, and got deferred adjudication. So he pled guilty. So he engaged in the conduct. And so in most states, and under federal law, it's the same as a conviction. But like California and New York, you couldn't consider it. But he was in Texas, and pew pew, in Texas, we don't have any controls like that, anything that limits that. So that's good. So anyway, but he did that. But his current employer never found out about the arrest. Okay. So they didn't know that their network administrator had been, pled guilty to illegally accessing a computer network. And so then what happened when they fired him? Well, same thing. He hacked into their system. He wiped out their payroll system. He just screw y'all and wiped it out. And so then he got prosecuted in federal court for illegally accessing computer network and, basically hacking, and got convicted this time in federal court, which is a reason to do federal searches, because you would have never known about it if you didn't search that federal case. And so on top of that, he did his federal time. And now when you find his LinkedIn, which he changes pretty regularly because we have him on our website, and every now and then I'll go find his current LinkedIn and update it because he changes it all the time. He's a consultant, and he's, in this really specific niche software that people need. And he's out there selling services, and probably none of his clients ever do background checks on him because he's just, he's either got his own little company set up or he's doing a 1099, and nobody ever checks on him, I'm sure. And so he's got this whole history of, this criminal history that should preclude him from ever accessing somebody's computer network. But if you don't do your due diligence, you'll never know. And that's a perfect example of why you should do it on your employees. And you should also do annual or some sort of periodic background checks on your employees. It doesn't have to be the full-blown criminal, but just the criminal in the place where they live and the place where they work, just setting a smaller scope. Or if they work remote and you go visit, you have a get-together, go to lunch to meet, and you see that they've got an ankle monitor. Those are the kind of things that really wake clients up is, we should be paying more attention along the way to what's going on with our employees. So those are just a few things.
Well, I appreciate you for opening up our eyes, giving us some things to really consider, and, a couple of chuckles along the way. I mean, that's hilarious with the guy that you just mentioned. I just want to know what he got fired for twice, that he felt the need to leave taunting messages and break into the database.
Yeah, I think he had anger management issues probably too. So
he has issues all around. But well, Mike, last remark. Where can everyone find you?
You can find us at imperativeinfo.com, and our sister company is PFC, Caregiver and Household Screening. So we also do background checks on nannies, domestic staff, and so that's same back end, but just the PFC is for those houses, families, things like that. And it's got like a softer, it's got kids on the website instead of the more corporate. But people need to know about the people that they're involving in their personal or business life. That's what we do.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, guys. And audience, please like, subscribe, comment. It helps everyone out. And Mike, till next time.
Thanks. Good to see you, Sam. Be well.